Most demons have ancient roots. They emerge from the oldest texts humanity ever produced: Sumerian clay tablets, the Hebrew Bible, Mesopotamian ritual, Egyptian myth, and have been feared, named, and catalogued across thousands of years of religious tradition. Mephistopheles does not belong to that lineage. He has no ancient pedigree, appears in no scripture, and was feared by no pre-Christian religion. He does not appear in any grimoire before the 16th century, and no tradition of demonology that predated him ever gave him so much as a footnote. He was born from a cheap pamphlet sold on the streets of Frankfurt in 1587, invented for a story about a scholar who sold his soul to the devil, and the devil who came to collect. Over the centuries, as the legend moved from page to stage to opera house, the full name Mephistopheles was gradually shortened to Mephisto, a contraction that became standard shorthand in theatre and popular culture by the 19th century and has remained the more familiar form ever since. The story passed through several hands before reaching its definitive form in the work of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, whose version became one of the most celebrated works in the German language. This is that story, and it begins not on earth, but in heaven. At the center of Goethe's story is a man named Faust, a German scholar who has spent his entire life in the pursuit of knowledge, working through philosophy, medicine, law, and theology, only to find that mastering all four has left him no closer to understanding what life is actually for. He is not ignorant or idle. He is, by any measure, one of the most educated men of his age, and that is precisely the source of his misery. He has reached the far end of everything scholarship can offer and found it empty. Goethe's story does not begin with him, however. It begins above him, in a scene that most readers do not expect, a conversation between God and the devil. The three archangels, Raphael, Gabriel, and Michael, open proceedings by praising creation. They describe the thunder of the sun, the turning of the earth, the storm and the calm of the sea in language that is hymn-like, formal, and reverent. Mephisto then enters the assembly, and he is candid from the outset about his inability to match the archangel's tone, and equally candid about his lack of interest in trying. Instead of looking upward at the grandeur of creation, he turns his gaze toward humanity, and what he finds there is not beauty, but misery. Mankind, he tells God, is a pitiable creature, granted just enough reason to behave more savagely than any animal, but not enough to find any peace with itself. He compares the human race to a grasshopper that leaps endlessly skyward and falls straight back into the grass, singing the same small song it has always sung. Things would go considerably better for people, Mephisto suggests, if God had simply never shown them the light of heaven at all, because all it does is illuminate how irreparably far short of it they fall. God does not dismiss this argument. Instead, he introduces a name into the conversation, the aforementioned scholar, Faust. Faust is counted among God's servants, a scholar who has devoted his life to the pursuit of knowledge and still finds himself hollow with dissatisfaction, a man who demands from heaven what it cannot give him, and from earth what it will not provide. God regards this restlessness not as a failing, but as a virtue, holding that the striving itself, however confused and misdirected it may appear, is precisely the point. Mephisto reads the same man differently. Where God sees a noble seeker, Mephisto sees someone tearing himself apart over questions with no answers, chasing an absolute he will never reach and suffering gratuitously for the effort. The wager that follows is deliberately structured in the image of the Book of Job. In that older story, Satan appears before God and challenges his confidence in his servant Job, arguing that Job's righteousness is nothing more than the product of an easy life, and that stripping that comfort away would cause the man to curse his creator outright. God permits the test, and Job endures it. Goethe places Mephisto in an almost identical position. The skeptic admitted into the court of heaven, confident that a good man can be brought to ruin by sufficient pressure applied with sufficient patience. The wager Mephisto proposes is, however, more philosophically ambitious than anything in Job. He does not simply intend to make Faust suffer. He intends to give Faust everything: pleasure, knowledge, power, and the full range of human experience. And to demonstrate through that abundance, none of it will prove sufficient. His argument is not that Faust is unusually weak or susceptible to corruption, but instead that humanity itself is constitutionally incapable of genuine satisfaction, fated always to desire what it does not possess, and to find what it does possess wanting. If Mephisto can demonstrate this through God's most striving servant, with a demon's full resources placed unreservedly at the man's disposal, then the indictment falls not on Faust alone, but on the whole of creation. God permits the attempt, though in Goethe's telling, permission and acceptance are not quite the same thing. He tells Mephisto that he is free to try, and then adds a condition that complicates the demon's position considerably. Men make mistakes as long as they strive, and that error is not a defect, but an inescapable feature of being alive. Striving, even blind and confused striving, is what gives a person any claim to being human in a meaningful sense. God is not troubled by Faust's restlessness. He is, in a manner of speaking, counting on it. God also tells his servants that he is glad to have Mephisto loose in the world, for the reason that humans become complacent too easily when left undisturbed. A good devil, he explains, is useful precisely because he forces people to keep moving, to keep reaching, rather than settling into the comfortable passivity that he considers the greater danger. In this conception, Mephisto is not simply God's adversary. He is, in some arrangement that neither of them appears entirely comfortable naming, God's instrument. When the heavens close and the archangels withdraw, Mephisto is left alone for a moment. He remarks to himself that it is always agreeable to see the old man, and that it is quite decent of a being of such stature to converse so civilly with the devil. Then he descends toward the world below, where a scholar is sitting in a study full of books he no longer believes in, and where a poison vial is waiting on a shelf. Faust has spent his life as a scholar, becoming an expert at several disciplines, but still feeling no closer to understanding the world than when he began. He has read everything that can be read, and the accumulation of all that knowledge has produced a specific and devastating kind of despair. The despair of a man who has discovered that knowledge alone cannot tell him what life is for. When scholarship failed him, he turned to magic, and magic proved equally hollow. On Easter Eve, alone in his study surrounded by books he no longer believes in, Faust picks up a vial of poison and comes very close to drinking it. The distant sound of church bells and a choir announcing Easter morning pulls him back, not to faith exactly, but to the memory of what faith once felt like, and that memory is enough to stay his hand. The following day, walking outside the city walls with his assistant Wagner, Faust passes among ordinary people celebrating the holiday. The townspeople cheer him as he goes by. His father was a doctor who tended the sick during a plague, and the community has never forgotten it. Faust accepts their gratitude with something closer to guilt than pride, suspecting that the crude medicines he and his father dispensed may have done as much harm as good. As evening falls, a black poodle begins circling the two scholars out in the field. Wagner sees a well-trained dog and nothing more. Faust watches the animal and perceives fire spiraling in its wake, trailing outward like a slowly tightening snare. He takes the dog home regardless. Back in his study, the animal refuses to settle. It growls and paces while Faust attempts to read, and when he opens the Gospel of John to translate it into German, the poodle grows violently agitated. Faust drives it back behind the stove with a magical spell, and the creature that emerges from behind the stove is no longer a dog. Mephisto steps out dressed as a travelling scholar, entirely composed, as though he had simply been waiting for the right moment to introduce himself. Their first conversation is an exchange of careful tests. Faust demands to know what the creature is, and Mephisto answers in riddles, describing himself as part of the power that always wills evil and always produces good. Faust soon discovers that Mephisto cannot leave through the study's doorway, because the pentagram carved into the threshold by some previous occupant holds him inside. Finding a demon bound by a scholar's protective symbol intriguing enough to warrant further conversation, Faust invites him to stay the night. Mephisto agrees and departs only to return the following day with a formal proposition. The offer Mephisto makes is structured as a wager within the larger wager already concluded in heaven. He will serve Faust completely throughout his earthly life, providing access to pleasure, knowledge, power, and any experience Faust might desire. In exchange, when Faust dies, he will serve Mephisto in whatever comes after. The basic terms are familiar enough from older versions of the legend. What distinguishes Goethe's telling is what Faust inserts into the agreement in return. Rather than simply accepting the promise of pleasure and experience, he adds a specific condition. If Mephisto can produce a single moment so complete, so charged with meaning, that Faust finds himself begging for time to stop. If he can bring Faust to say the words, "Linger a while, thou art so fair," then the devil wins everything. If he cannot produce such a moment across an entire lifetime of effort, the arrangement yields Mephisto nothing. Faust agrees to these terms with the confidence of a man who believes the condition will never be met, because he is already certain that no experience the world can offer will ever be enough to make him want to stay inside it. The contract is signed in blood, which Mephisto insists upon over Faust's objections. Faust argues that his word of honor ought to be sufficient. Mephisto remains firm on the point, noting that a drop of blood carries more weight than any written promise. The pact is sealed, and the two set out. Mephisto begins with what he considers dependable pleasures. He takes Faust to Auerbach's cellar, a tavern where a group of men are drinking themselves into loud and uncomplicated happiness. Faust watches the scene with open contempt and feels nothing resembling temptation. Mephisto notes the failure and revises his approach. He brings Faust to a witch who brews a potion that restores him to a young man's body, stripping away the decades of scholarly exhaustion and replacing them with physical vigor and appetite. Emerging from the witch's kitchen, Faust catches the reflection of a woman in a magic mirror, and something in him, dormant for a very long time, stirs to life. Her name is Margaret. The people of her town call her Gretchen, and she is about to become the center of the most consequential thing Mephisto will do in the course of their arrangement. Not through malice alone, but through the particular cruelty of giving a man exactly what he asked for. Margaret, who is known as Gretchen by people around her, is not a complicated person. She is a young woman of modest means, devoutly religious, living simply and caring for her household since most of her family has gone. Her father dead, her brother away at war, her infant sister nursed to her last breath by Gretchen's own hands. She is, in the most uncomplicated sense available in this story, good. When Faust first passes her on the street and tries to take her arm, she refuses him without hesitation. This presents Mephisto with a genuine difficulty. He admits to Faust that Gretchen's purity places her beyond his direct influence. He cannot reach her the way he can reach people whose souls have already admitted some crack of compromise. What he can do is arrange circumstances. He is, after all, a being of considerable practical ingenuity, and the seduction of an innocent woman is ultimately an engineering problem. The first instrument he uses is jewelry. While Gretchen is away from her room, Mephisto and Faust enter and leave a casket of fine jewels in her wardrobe. Gretchen finds them, delights in them privately, and brings them to her mother, who immediately suspects their origin and hands them over to the church. The priest accepts them on behalf of God without any apparent hesitation. Mephisto is characteristically dry about this outcome, but undeterred, he produces a second, finer casket. This time, Gretchen takes it to her neighbour Martha rather than her mother, and Martha encourages her to wear the pieces in secret. The jewels are doing their work, not corrupting Gretchen directly, but introducing her, gently and incrementally, to the idea of concealment. The second instrument is Martha herself. Mephisto calls on her in the guise of a travelling stranger, informs her that her long-absent husband has died on his wanderings, and offers to return with a companion who can formally attest to the death before a magistrate. The companion he has in mind is Faust. Faust objects to this arrangement, since it requires him to bear false witness about a man he has never met, in order to bring two people together under the cover of a garden meeting. Mephisto reminds him that he has already lied and will lie again. Faust concedes the point and goes. That evening in Martha's garden, Gretchen and Faust speak for the first time at any length. She tells him of her life, its losses, its smallness, its labours. Faust is struck not merely by her beauty, but by something he had not expected. The quiet order of a life lived without ambition, sustained by duty and faith. Alongside them in the garden, Mephisto keeps Martha occupied, deflecting her conversational advances with practiced boredom. He is performing a function here that he will repeat throughout the story, not tempting Faust directly, but clearing the ground around him so that Faust's own desires can operate without obstruction. What follows over the next weeks is a courtship that Gretchen enters with sincere feeling, and Faust enters with a passion he cannot entirely distinguish from genuine love. She is troubled by his companion from the beginning. She tells Faust directly that something about the man gives her a cold she cannot explain, a nameless terror that she feels in his presence, even when he does nothing and says nothing to warrant it. Mephisto, informed of this afterwards, is quietly pleased. He takes her instinctive recognition of him as a mark of her perceptiveness, and her inability to act on it as proof that perceptiveness alone is no protection. Faust eventually persuades Gretchen to allow him to visit her at night, and gives her a vial of sleeping potion to add to her mother's evening drink, so that the older woman will not be disturbed. Gretchen administers the potion, and her mother does not wake. She does not wake the following morning either, or any morning after that. The dose, or the repeated doses, prove fatal, though neither Faust nor Mephisto acknowledge this outcome with anything beyond a brief and cold indifference. Gretchen is left to carry it alone, along with everything that comes after. The pregnancy she soon discovers, the shame of the town, the curses of her brother Valentine when he returns from the war and learns what has happened. Valentine's end is swift and ugly. He stands in the dark street outside his sister's house waiting for her lover, and when Faust and Mephisto appear below her window, Mephisto singing a cynical little song about a girl who gives herself away, Valentine confronts them. A sword fight follows in the dark, and Valentine falls. He dies in the street cursing his sister publicly, calling her a whore before the gathered neighbours, ensuring that whatever remained of her reputation dies with him. Faust and Mephisto flee the town before dawn. Mephisto then takes Faust to Walpurgis Night, the witches' sabbath on the summit of the Brocken Mountain, held annually on the last night of April, where all the spirits of darkness gather to revel in the devil's company. It is, in its way, the most honest environment Mephisto has shown Faust, a place stripped of the social veneers and moral performances that govern ordinary life. Faust moves through the revels in a kind of daze. He dances with a young witch and then recoils when a mouse springs from her mouth. he sees, at a distance, a pale young woman who looks exactly like Gretchen and cannot look away. Mephisto intervenes quickly and steers him toward a small theatre on the mountainside, where an amateur play is being staged among the demons, and where Faust's attention can be managed. What Mephisto does not tell Faust on Walpurgis night is what he already knows: that Gretchen, alone and in a state of desperate grief, has drowned the infant child she bore after Faust abandoned her, and has been arrested and condemned to death for it. When Faust eventually learns the truth, his rage falls on Mephisto with an intensity that briefly strips the demon of his composure. He curses Mephisto for concealing it. Mephisto answers, with a flatness that is perhaps the most quietly devastating line in the entire story, that she is not the first. Faust demands to be taken to the prison immediately, and Mephisto obliges, obtaining the keys, sending the guards into a sleep, opening the cell. Inside, Faust finds Gretchen in a state that is not quite madness and not quite sanity. She does not recognize him at first, taking him for her executioner. When she does recognize him, she reaches for him, holds him, speaks of everything that has happened in the rambling way of a person whose mind has been broken by too much grief, absorbed in too small a space. She asks him to dig her mother's grave, to place her baby in her arms when she is laid in the earth, and to lie beside her on her left-hand side, close enough that she can reach him. Faust pleads with her to leave. He has horses waiting. Mephisto has cleared the way. They can be gone before sunrise. Gretchen refuses. She has accepted the judgment that has been passed on her, and she will not trade whatever remains of her soul for an escape that would simply extend her ruin into different geography. When Mephisto enters the cell to tell Faust that they must go or share her fate, Gretchen sees the demon and recognizes him for what he is. She does not address him. She prays, committing her soul to God's judgment instead. Mephisto pulls Faust from the cell, and as they go, a voice is heard, pronouncing that she is saved. Mephisto's own accounting of the matter is the opposite. She is condemned. The two verdicts stand unreconciled as the scene closes. Gretchen's last audible sound in the play is her calling Faust's name, his given name, Heinrich, into the empty doorway after him. It echoes, and then Part 1 ends. Faust wakes at the opening of Part 2 in a field of flowers, restored by the spirits of nature and largely freed from the guilt of what occurred in Part 1. He and Mephisto travel to the court of a failing emperor, where Mephisto resolves the imperial debt crisis by introducing paper money backed against untapped natural wealth, an elegant piece of fraud that stabilizes the empire temporarily while securing the two companions whatever patronage they need. They conjure the spirits of Paris and Helen of Troy for the emperor's entertainment, and when Faust catches sight of Helen, he is seized by a desire so intense that he reaches for her and loses consciousness. Helen of Troy becomes his next obsession, the absolute of beauty as Gretchen had been the absolute of innocence, and Mephisto is obliged to pursue that obsession into the depths of classical mythology on Faust's behalf. Faust eventually reaches Helen, forms a union with her across the barrier of myth and time, and fathers a son, Euphorion, a child of impossible vitality who soars ever higher until he falls and dies, at which point Helen herself dissolves back into antiquity, leaving Faust with nothing but her garments and her memory. The final act of Part 2 takes place many years later, with Faust now a very old man who has spent decades overseeing a vast land reclamation project by the sea, pushing back the ocean with dikes and dams to create new territory that he intends to give over to a free people. It is, by any measure, the most constructive thing he has done in his long association with Mephisto. It is also shadowed by a crime. On the edge of his domain, an old couple named Baucis and Philemon live in a small cottage near a chapel, the last property within sight of Faust's lands that does not belong to him. Their presence disturbs him with a persistence that he cannot entirely explain or justify. He orders Mephisto to have them relocated peacefully. Mephisto, who has his own relationship with the word peacefully, and who has never much troubled himself with the fine distinctions between relocation and elimination, sends his servants to carry out the order. Baucis and Philemon are killed. Their cottage and chapel burn. Mephisto returns with a mild account of what's transpired, and Faust is left with the weight of 2 more deaths that his desire and his failure to specify limits on the demon he employs have produced. It is shortly after this that the personification of care finds Faust and breathes upon his eyes, blinding him. Faust, now sightless, can hear the sounds of digging outside and assumes it is the work of his labourers continuing the land reclamation. It is in fact Mephisto directing the dead, the lemures, spirits of the deceased, to dig Faust's grave. Blind and mistaken about what he hears, Faust experiences a final vision of the people who will one day live freely in the lands he has helped to create. And in that vision he encounters the closest thing to the condition the pact requires, a moment he would willingly prolong, a moment he finds so full of meaning that he speaks the words, "Linger a while. Thou art so fair." He drops dead on the words, as Mephisto is watching. By the strict letter of the contract, Faust has just conceded. He spoke the words, "The wager is won, and the soul should be his." Mephisto summons demons from the open gates of hell, sets the lemures to their burial work, and arranges his forces to receive Faust's departing spirit at the moment it leaves the body. He waits with the confidence of a creditor who has finally, after enormous patience, arrived to collect a very old debt. What comes instead is light and roses. A host of angels descends from above, scattering rose petals that burn and scatter the assembled demons. Mephisto holds his ground. The roses are uncomfortable. Their holy nature causes him physical distress, but he is disinclined to retreat from what is legally, by any reading of the contract, his due. The angels press closer, and then something unexpected occurs. Mephistopheles, spirit of negation, enemy of beauty, being who has long since argued that he is incapable of anything resembling tenderness, finds himself powerfully attracted to the angels. He feels, of all things, desire. He describes this invasion of feeling with the bewildered fury of a man discovering an allergy he did not know he had. And in the time that this confusion occupies him, the angels take Faust's soul and carry it upward. Mephisto recognizes what has happened with full clarity. He has been deceived. He has spent the better part of a human lifetime in service to this man, guiding him through every pleasure and catastrophe the world could furnish, and at the precise moment of collection, his own capacity for feeling, the very faculty he has always insisted he does not possess, has been used against him as a trap. He calls it what it is, a theft, conducted under the cover of beauty, by opponents who knew exactly which weakness to exploit in a creature who had never quite managed to eliminate all feeling from himself. Then a soul rises. Gretchen, who in Goethe's afterlife has become a penitent figure in heaven, pleads before the Virgin for Faust's forgiveness, and is granted the role of guiding his newly arrived soul into the higher spheres. The wager that began in heaven, with Mephisto confident and God permissive at the beginning, ends in heaven, with Mephisto empty-handed, while he watches Gretchen leading Faust towards the light. The angels who carry Faust's soul announce as they ascend that whoever strives in ceaseless effort may earn redemption still. It is the theological verdict on everything that preceded it, that striving, Even striving that produces disaster and guilt and ruin is not the same as damnation. Faust spent a lifetime in the company of a demon and arrived in heaven regardless. Mephisto argued from the beginning that humanity is broken and incapable of salvation, and the story answers him by saving the most comprehensively ruinous human being it could find. Goethe himself said that the love which comes to Faust's aid at the end is Gretchen's, and that the striving which earns his redemption was always his own. And Mephisto, who made both possible by pushing against them, stands at the empty grave and finds that his most complete and consequential failure was also, by God's own design, his most essential contribution. In the aftermath, Mephisto mutters that everything amounts to nothing, and that past is a stupid word, that he would sooner have the everlasting void than stand witness to what just occurred. What remains when the play is over is a figure that resists the clean verdict the story seems to offer. The demon lost, the soul escaped, and God's wager was won. And yet the Mephisto who stood at that empty grave was never quite the simple agent of evil he claimed to be. He was not a beast who hates without complexity, nor a rebel who rages against heaven with burning conviction. He was something more unsettling, a being who understood human nature with perfect clarity, argued his case with genuine philosophical precision, and was defeated not by righteousness, but by a feeling he could not fully suppress in himself, undone in the end by the same capacity for longing that he had spent eternity mocking in others. That is the Mephisto that Goethe left the world, not a warning about the devil, but a mirror. So which character was your favourite in the story of Mephistopheles? Was it the ambitious, soul-weary Faust, the innocent and tragic Gretchen, or the silver-tongued devil himself? I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss my future videos. And with that, I'll see you in the next one.